You think you know Mary Tudor, known as Bloody Mary, the queen who burned hundreds alive just because of their faith, right? Wrong. What if I told you the woman we call Bloody Mary was never meant to be a monster? What if, behind that name, stained in fire and blood, was a child torn apart by her parents' divorce, a daughter locked away from her dying mother, and a princess stripped of her crown before she even wore it? This is the story of silence, the story of betrayal, the story of a woman who clung to love and faith only to be remembered as a villain. You're probably thinking that's impossible. After all, history tells us she was a tyrant. But history? It lies. And Mary's truth has been buried for centuries. So let's reopen her story together, because the real Mary Tudor is not what you think.
If this tragedy already pulls you in, give this video a like. It helps his story reach more eyes.
February 18, 1516, Greenwich Palace. A baby girl takes her first breath in a world that desperately wanted her to be a boy. But Henry VIII has learned to hide disappointment behind royal ceremony. The cannons fire, the church bells ring. England celebrates its new princess as if she's exactly what they'd been praying for. 3-year-old Mary Tudor doesn't understand politics yet. She doesn't know that her worth is measured entirely by her father's need for male heirs and powerful alliances. She only knows that everyone loves her. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, speaks to Mary in Spanish, teaching her songs from Castile and stories about Spanish queens who ruled in their own right. Her father lifts her onto his shoulders during court ceremonies, showing off his brilliant daughter, who speaks Latin like a scholar and French like a native. In 1522, at 6 years old, Mary becomes engaged to her cousin Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe. The betrothal ceremony is magnificent. Mary wears cloth of gold that costs more than most people earn in a lifetime. Foreign ambassadors bow to her as if she's already an empress. Henry beams with pride as he watches his daughter perform her role perfectly. Mary curtsies to the Spanish delegation and speaks her betrothal vows in flawless Latin. Everyone is impressed. Everyone is charmed. Nobody tells Mary that royal betrothals are just expensive pieces of paper. She believes she will one day rule both England and the Holy Roman Empire. She believes her marriage will unite two great Catholic kingdoms. She believes her father when he tells her she's his precious jewel, his greatest treasure, his hope for England's future. Mary spent her childhood learning to be an empress. She masters Spanish, French, Latin, and Italian. She studies theology, philosophy, and statecraft. She practices the virginals until her fingers are sore and dances until her feet bleed. She memorizes the genealogies of every royal house in Europe. Everything Mary learns reinforces the same message. She is special. She is chosen. She is destined for greatness. But there's something else happening that Mary's too young to understand. Every month that passes without a baby brother makes her father's smile a little more forced. Every failed pregnancy makes her mother's prayers a little more desperate. Every diplomatic meeting about her future marriage feels more urgent than the last. By 1525, Henry has been married to Catherine for 16 years. They've had multiple pregnancies, but only Mary survived infancy. Henry is starting to panic. He needs a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. He needs a male heir to prevent civil war after his death. And Catherine, now 40 years old, is running out of time to give him one. Then, Charles V, her betrothed, sends a message that destroys Mary's world. He's breaking their engagement. Just like that, Mary's future as Holy Roman Empress vanishes. The marriage that was supposed to unite two great Catholic kingdoms becomes another canceled diplomatic dream. Mary asks her tutor why Charles changed his mind. The answer she receives is devastating. "Bastards don't marry emperors, your ladyship." Bastard. The word hits Mary like a physical blow. But she still doesn't understand what it means. How can she be a bastard when her parents were married in Westminster Abbey? How can she be illegitimate when the Pope himself blessed their union? Mary is about to learn the most painful lesson of her childhood. Love and law mean nothing when men decide they want something else. And that's when Henry notices Anne Boleyn. Anne is young, charming, and most importantly, she could give Henry the son Catherine couldn't deliver. But Anne knows this story before. She watched her own sister, Mary, used and discarded by the very same king. Anne knows Henry doesn't just break hearts, he breaks women, and she refuses to become another forgotten mistress. So she plays a dangerous game. If Henry wants her, it won't be in secret. She demands a crown. She demands to be queen. There's just one problem. Henry already has a wife, but Henry VIII has never let inconvenient details stop him from getting what he wants. He decides his marriage to Catherine was never valid in God's eyes. He decides to annul 18 years of marriage and start over. Little Mary doesn't understand what's happening when diplomatic meetings about her marriage suddenly stop. She doesn't know why her household is being restructured or why her beautiful gowns are being replaced with simpler dresses. All she knows is that something has changed, and nobody will explain what. Henry is preparing to annul his marriage to Catherine. Parliament is preparing to declare Mary illegitimate. The Catholic Church is preparing to lose England forever. And 9-year-old Mary Tudor is about to discover that all the promises adults make to children are just pretty lies designed to keep them quiet until the adults change their mind. The girl who thought she would rule 2 empires is about to become a bastard who serves her father's new wife. But this is just the beginning of Mary's education in Tudor Betrayal.
1533. Mary Tudor is 17 years old, and her world is ending. Henry has married Anne Boleyn in secret. Parliament has passed the Act of Succession, officially declaring Mary a bastard. And Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, has annulled her parents' marriage. Overnight, the Princess of England becomes just another nobleman's illegitimate daughter. But the cruelest blow comes in the form of 3 words that will haunt Mary for the rest of her life. You may not see your mother. Catherine of Aragon has been banished to Kimbleton Castle, forbidden from using the title Queen, and cut off from all contact with her daughter. Henry fears that mother and daughter together could become the center of a Catholic rebellion, so he separates them forever. Mary writes letter after letter, begging her father for permission to visit Catherine. She promises to accept any conditions, follow any rules, submit to any humiliation, if only she can see her mother one more time. Henry ignores every letter. Meanwhile, Mary is forced to witness Anne Boleyn's triumph. The woman who destroyed her family now wears her mother's crown, sleeps in her mother's bed, and enjoys her mother's husband. When Anne gives birth to Elizabeth in September 1533, Mary's humiliation becomes complete. Henry names the baby Princess Elizabeth. He declares Elizabeth his legitimate heir, and then he delivers the final insult. Mary was forced into Elizabeth's household, expected to serve the baby who had replaced her. Imagine the psychological torture. Mary, once the heir to England, was now stripped of her title and forced into Elizabeth's household as a subordinate. She, who once received ambassadors from across Europe, now curtsies to an infant who could barely hold her head upright. She, who learned statecraft to rule kingdoms, now manages Elizabeth's feeding schedule. Every day is a fresh reminder that she's been replaced. But Mary surprises everyone, including herself, by genuinely loving Elizabeth.
Despite everything Anne Boleyn represents, despite the pain Elizabeth's existence causes her, Mary cannot bring herself to hate this innocent child. She teaches Elizabeth Spanish words. She protects her from court gossip. She watches over her with a tenderness that breaks the hearts of anyone who understands their relationship. Mary is mothering the child who stole her birthright. The irony would be beautiful if it weren't so tragic. Then, in January 1536, Catherine of Aragon dies at Kimbleton Castle. Mary doesn't even know her mother is on her deathbed until it's too late. For months, she has begged Henry for permission to visit Catherine. Each time, her father refuses. Each time, Mary is told her presence might agitate the Queen. In truth, Henry is punishing them both. So Catherine spends her final days alone. No daughter to hold her hand, no comfort in her darkest hour. Just a handful of loyal servants and a faith that never wavers. She dies still insisting she is England's true queen, still wearing her wedding ring, still refusing to accept the annulment that destroyed her family. Mary learns of her mother's death from a servant, not from her father, not from the court, just a passing whisper that shatters her world. She collapses in grief. The one person who truly loved her, the one anchor she had left, is gone. Henry adds cruelty to cruelty. He forbids Mary from attending the funeral. She's locked in her rooms while the coffin is lowered into the ground. Instead of saying goodbye in a chapel, she spends the day surrounded by the secret letters Catherine had smuggled to her. Letters filled with love, advice, and desperate words trying to keep their bond alive despite the walls Henry built between them. In Catherine's final letter, she calls Mary "my dearest daughter" and begs her to serve God and your father. Mary clutches the parchment as if it were her mother's hand. She realizes Catherine died believing her daughter would somehow forgive Henry. But forgiveness is the last thing in Mary's heart. She's been stripped of everything: her legitimacy, her inheritance, her future, and now her mother. And yet she's expected to smile, curtsy, and be grateful for whatever scraps her father throws her way. Mary makes a decision that will shape the rest of her life. She refuses to accept the oath acknowledging Henry as supreme head of the Church of England. It's not just about religion, though Mary is devoutly Catholic. It's about her mother. Accepting the oath means accepting that Catherine was never truly Henry's wife. It means accepting her parents' 18-year marriage was a sin. It means accepting her own illegitimacy. Mary would rather die than betray her mother's memory. Henry's response is swift and brutal. Mary is stripped of her remaining privileges. Her household is dissolved. She's forbidden from leaving her apartment without permission. She cannot attend court functions, receive visitors, or correspond with foreign dignitaries. Essentially, Henry places his own daughter under house arrest. For 2 years, Mary lives in this twilight existence. She's not quite a prisoner, but she's certainly not free.
Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn's star begins to fall. She suffers miscarriage after miscarriage. She fails to give Henry the son he craves. Her sharp tongue makes enemies. Her influence makes rivals. By 1536, Henry was already plotting her removal. In May, Anne is dragged to the Tower of London, tried for treason and adultery, and executed by sword. Her daughter, Elizabeth, barely 3 years old, is stripped of her title of princess, declared illegitimate, declared a bastard. For Mary, it's like watching her own nightmare replayed in another child's life. She knows the sting of that word, bastard. She knows the humiliation of losing her place, her clothes, her future. She remembers being paraded in fine gowns as England's heiress, only to be shoved aside, forgotten, and forced to curtsy to the child who replaced her. And now, Elizabeth, innocent, wide-eyed, still learning to talk, suffers the same punishment. Mary should feel triumph. Elizabeth is the living symbol of everything that destroyed her mother, everything that broke her own life. But when she looks at the toddler, all she feels is pity. She gathers Elizabeth in her arms. She whispers Spanish lullabies. She shields her from the gossip that echoes through the corridors. She makes sure the little girl is dressed, fed, and comforted. Mary becomes what Elizabeth doesn't have, a mother figure. She comforts her half-sister with the tenderness she once received from Catherine. To everyone at court, it looks like a cruel twist of fate, Henry's discarded daughter raising the child who replaced her. But to Mary, it's something more. Protecting Elizabeth becomes her quiet rebellion, a way to prove she is stronger than the cruelty that shaped her, a way to keep alive the memory of her own mother. And so, while the court whispers about bastards and broken queens, Mary holds Elizabeth close. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so heartbreaking. But instead of bringing the sisters together, their shared illegitimacy creates a new problem. England has no clear heir. This terrifies Henry's advisors. A kingdom without a clear succession is a kingdom headed for civil war. They pressure Henry to reconcile with Mary. They argue that restoring her to the succession would stabilize the realm and demonstrate royal mercy. Henry agrees, but with conditions. Mary must acknowledge him as supreme head of the Church of England. She must accept that her parents' marriage was invalid. She must embrace her own illegitimacy. For months, Mary resists. She writes letter after letter, begging her father to restore her without forcing her to betray her principles. Henry's response is typically blunt: submit completely or remain a bastard forever. By July 1536, Mary is emotionally and physically exhausted. The stress of fighting her father has given her chronic headaches, irregular periods, and fainting spells. She's been separated from her parents for 3 years. She's been living in limbo for 3 years. She breaks. In a letter that must have felt like signing her soul away, Mary writes, "I acknowledge the King's majesty to be my sovereign Lord and King, and do submit myself to His Highness in all things." She signs away her principles. She betrays her mother's memory. She accepts her own illegitimacy. But here's what the history books don't tell you about Mary's submission. As she signs that letter, Mary makes herself a promise, one that will transform her from a broken teenager into the woman history calls Bloody Mary. She vows she will never again trust anyone who claims to love her. And she vows that when she has power, if she ever has power, she will make sure everyone who hurt her family pays the price.
July 1536. Mary Tudor has signed away her soul to buy her father's forgiveness, but Henry's version of forgiveness feels remarkably like punishment. Mary is restored to court, but as the king's illegitimate daughter, not as a princess. She receives a modest allowance, but nothing like her previous wealth. She's invited to court functions, but only as decoration, never as a participant in serious political discussions. Henry parades Mary around like a reformed rebel, proof that even his most stubborn children eventually submit to his will. Mary learns to smile when Henry's courtiers make jokes about her youthful foolishness in resisting his authority. She learns to laugh when people reference her unfortunate legitimacy issues. She learns to thank her father publicly for his generous mercy in accepting her back into his household. Every public display of gratitude feels like swallowing poison. But Mary has discovered something about herself during those years of resistance. She's stronger than anyone imagined. The girl who once fainted at the sight of blood now endures daily humiliation with iron composure.
The princess who used to cry when her tutors criticized her Latin now faces Henry's cruelest courtiers with unflinching dignity. Mary has learned to hide her true feelings so completely that even she sometimes forgets what they are. Meanwhile, Henry marries Jane Seymour, his third wife. In October 1537, Jane gives birth to the son Henry has wanted for 28 years, Edward Tudor. Mary watches the celebrations with complicated emotions. Part of her genuinely rejoices. England finally has a male heir, which means the succession is secure. But part of her feels like she's witnessing the final nail in her coffin. Edward's birth proves that Henry was right to set aside Catherine and Mary. If he'd remained married to Catherine, if he'd stuck with his bastard daughter as his heir, England would never have gotten this precious prince. Mary's very existence becomes an embarrassment, a reminder of Henry's mistake in waiting so long to remarry. But there's something else troubling about Edward's birth. Jane Seymour dies 12 days later from puerperal sepsis, leaving Edward motherless. Henry is devastated by Jane's death. She was the wife who gave him what he'd always wanted. But Henry is also terrified of losing Edward. The baby prince becomes the most precious thing in England, surrounded by doctors, nurses, and tasters who monitor his every breath. Henry turns to Mary for help. He needs someone he can trust to help raise Edward, someone who understands royal protocol, speaks multiple languages, and has experience managing households, someone who won't have political motivations for harming the prince. Mary accepts the responsibility with mixed feelings. On one hand, she finally has a real purpose again. She's helping to raise England's future king. She's contributing something valuable to the realm. On the other hand, she's once again playing mother to the child who replaced her. Mary throws herself into Edward's care with the same intensity she once brought to her own education. She oversees her tutors, monitors her health, and ensures he learns proper royal behavior.
But as Edward grows from baby to toddler to young boy, Mary notices something troubling. Henry is raising Edward to view Catholicism as England's greatest enemy. Edward's tutors are all Protestant reformers. His lessons emphasize the corruption of the Catholic Church and the righteousness of Henry's break with Rome. His prayers are in English, not Latin. Mary watches in horror as Edward, her beloved little brother, is systematically taught to hate everything she holds sacred. By 1547, when Henry dies and 9-year-old Edward becomes king, Mary's worst fears are realized. Edward's advisors are radical Protestant reformers who view Mary's Catholicism as a threat to England's religious settlement. They allow Mary to attend private Catholic masses in her own household, but they make it clear this tolerance is temporary. The pressure on Mary to convert intensifies. Edward's advisors sent Protestant theologians to debate with Mary. They invite her to attend Protestant services at court. They suggest that her outdated religious views are preventing her from playing a more prominent role in her brother's government. Mary refuses every attempt to change her faith, but the psychological toll is enormous. Mary developed what modern doctors would recognize as symptoms of chronic stress and trauma: severe headaches, irregular menstrual cycles, digestive problems, and episodes of fainting. The girl who once craved her father's approval now struggles to get through each day without collapsing. Then, in 1549, Edward's advisors, led by the Duke of Northumberland, made a decision that shatters Mary's remaining illusions about family loyalty. They forbid Mary from hearing Catholic Mass, even in private. Mary is devastated. The Mass is her last connection to her mother's memory, her last source of spiritual comfort, her last act of defiance against the people who destroyed her family. She writes to Edward personally, begging him to remember their father's promise that she could worship privately according to her conscience. Edward's response reveals how completely he's absorbed his tutor's anti-Catholic propaganda. He lectures Mary about the dangers of false religion. He explains that allowing her to attend Mass would compromise his duty to protect England from papal corruption. He suggests that her refusal to embrace Protestant truth shows a lack of love for both God and her king. The little boy Mary helped raise, the baby brother who once called her most entirely beloved sister and clung to her for comfort after their mother's death, is now her religious prosecutor. Mary remembers visiting him, guiding him in his studies, and protecting him from court gossip. She truly loved him as if he were her own child. But now that same Edward, once so affectionate, sees her exactly the way Henry once did, as an inconvenient obstacle to be managed, manipulated, or eliminated. He writes to her with chilling bluntness, "You must no longer keep Mass in your house, for it is against our laws. If you do, you shall be punished." She spent her entire life serving Tudor kings who claimed to love her, while systematically destroying everything she valued. Henry destroyed her legitimacy. Edward is destroying her faith. Mary begins to understand that love in the Tudor family is just another weapon. And she begins to plan what she'll do if she ever gets the chance to wield that weapon herself.
Year 1553. Edward Tudor is 15 years old and dying. The brilliant boy king who was supposed to secure England's Protestant future is wasting away from what doctors now believe was tuberculosis. His cough produces blood. His body is skeletal. His skin has taken on the grayish pallor that everyone recognizes, but nobody dares to name. Edward is running out of time. But even on his deathbed, Edward is more concerned about Mary's soul than his own survival. During what will be their final conversation, Edward begs Mary to abandon Catholicism and embrace the Protestant faith. He argues that her salvation depends on accepting religious truth. He warns her that continuing in papist superstition will damn her eternal soul. Mary listens to her dying brother lecture her about religion and feels something break inside her chest. This is the child she helped raise, the boy she taught to walk, to speak, to behave like a prince, and he's spending his final days trying to convert her. Mary realizes that Edward doesn't see her as his sister. He sees her as his spiritual failure, a soul he couldn't save from Catholic damnation. Even her love for Edward has been poisoned by religious politics. But Edward's dying wish isn't just about Mary's spiritual welfare, it's about England's political future. Edward knows that if he dies, Mary becomes queen, and Mary, as a devout Catholic, will undo every Protestant reform Edward and his advisors have implemented. Edward would rather commit treason than let a Catholic inherit his throne. In May 1553, Edward signs a document called the Devise for the Succession that attempted to exclude both Mary and Elizabeth from the throne. Instead, Edward names Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as his heir. Jane Grey is young, intelligent, and, most importantly, committed to Protestant reform. She's also completely unprepared to be queen and has no desire for the crown. But Edward's advisors, led by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, see Jane as their chance to maintain power after Edward's death. They convince Edward that excluding Mary is necessary to protect England from Catholic tyranny. On July 6, 1553, Edward Tudor dies at Greenwich Palace. He's 15 years old. He's been king for 6 years, and his final act is an attempt to disinherit the sister who helped raise him. But Edward's advisors underestimate Mary Tudor's determination to claim her birthright.
When Mary learns that Jane Grey has been proclaimed queen, she doesn't flee to the continent or accept defeat quietly. She fights. Mary escapes to East Anglia, where she has extensive land holdings and loyal Catholic supporters. She sends letters to every nobleman in England demanding they acknowledge her as Henry VIII's rightful heir. The response is overwhelming. Even Protestant nobles who disagree with Mary's religion acknowledge that she has the stronger legal claim to the throne. Henry VIII's will explicitly named Mary as Edward's successor. Parliamentary law confirms her rights. Jane Grey's supporters realize they've made a catastrophic miscalculation. Within 9 days, Jane's support collapses. Northumberland is arrested. Jane herself is imprisoned in the Tower of London. On July 19, 1553, Mary Tudor entered London in triumph. The crowds are massive and enthusiastic. Church bells ring across the city.
After 37 years of humiliation, bastardization, and exile, Mary has achieved the impossible. She's queen. But her triumph isn't bloodless. Northumberland, Jane Grey's father-in-law and the mastermind of Edward's devise for the succession, is executed for treason. So are his closest allies. Their deaths serve as a warning to anyone who dares challenge Mary's legitimacy. Now Mary faces another question. What should she do with Jane Grey? Jane is 15 years old, younger than Mary was when Henry forced her to sign away her legitimacy. Jane was clearly manipulated by ambitious adults who used her as a pawn in their political games. Jane never wanted to be queen and showed no enthusiasm for usurping Mary's rights. But her marriage sealed her fate. Jane had been wed to Guilford Dudley, son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the very man who pushed Edward VI to name Jane as heir. Northumberland wasn't protecting Jane, he was protecting his own power. By marrying Jane to his son, he planned to make himself the father-in-law of a queen and the true ruler of England. That alliance made Jane dangerous in Mary's eyes. Even if Jane herself was innocent, her marriage tied her to the Dudleys, the same family who had tried to rob Mary of her crown. However, Jane Grey is different. The 15-year-old girl remains locked in the Tower of London. Unlike her father-in-law, she isn't executed, at least not yet. Mary hesitates. She doesn't want to kill a child, especially her own cousin who was clearly manipulated by ruthless men. For now, Jane lives. But her survival will prove temporary. Something is going to change Mary's thoughts about mercy. She was about to learn that mercy is weakness, forgiveness is stupidity, and the only way to protect what you love is to destroy anyone who threatens it. The girl once broken by her father's rejection is about to become the queen that history remembers as Bloody Mary. February 1554. Mary Tudor has been queen for 7 months. She has restored Catholic Mass, reconciled England with Rome, and shown the world that a woman can claim a throne through force of will and popular support. But Mary's greatest triumph is about to become her greatest vulnerability, because she's decided to marry Philip of Spain. The announcement sends shockwaves through England. Philip is the son of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the same Charles who broke his engagement to Mary 28 years ago. He's 11 years younger than Mary, devastatingly handsome, and most troublingly, completely foreign. English nobles fear Spanish domination. Protestant merchants worry about losing trade advantages. Common people riot in the streets, shouting that they don't want a foreign king. But Mary doesn't care about popular opinion. At 38 years old, she's finally found the love story she's waited her entire life to experience. When Mary sees Philip's portrait painted by the master artist Titian, she falls in love instantly. Philip looks noble, devout, and romantically mysterious. Everything about him seems designed to heal the wounds Henry and Edward inflicted on her heart. Mary convinces herself that Philip will love her, not for her crown,
but for her devotion to God and her fierce loyalty to Catholic truth. She's forgotten that royal marriages are business transactions, not romantic fairy tales. The opposition to Mary's Spanish marriage reaches its peak when Sir Thomas Wyatt leads an armed rebellion toward London. Wyatt commands nearly 3,000 men, including Protestant nobles who fear Catholic restoration and English patriots who refuse to accept foreign rule. His army marches from Kent toward Westminster, gathering supporters who believe Mary's marriage will destroy English independence. For a terrifying week in February 1554, it seems like Mary might lose her throne over her choice of husband. But Mary Tudor has spent her entire life fighting for things other people tried to take from her. She's not about to let a rebellion steal her chance at happiness. Mary addresses the citizens of London at Guildhall in one of the most remarkable speeches in English history. She stands before thousands of her subjects, many of whom sympathize with the rebels, and speaks with a passion and authority that reminds everyone why she's Henry VIII's daughter. "I am your queen, to whom at my coronation, when I was wedded to the realm and laws of the same, you promised your allegiance and obedience to me, and that I am the right and true inheritor of the crown of this realm of England, I take all Christendom to witness." Mary promises that Philip will respect English laws and customs. She argues that the marriage will bring powerful allies and protection from France. She appeals to their loyalty, their patriotism, and their sense of honor. The rebellion fails. Wyatt is captured and executed. But the rebellion leaves Mary with one final decision that weighs heavier than all the rest. Jane Grey. For months, the young girl has remained locked in the Tower, a forgotten prisoner. Mary had pitied her at first, sparing her life. After all, Jane was only 15 years old when men forced a crown onto her head. She never sought the throne, never raised a sword against Mary. But now Wyatt's rebels have marched under Jane's name. They shouted out that Jane was England's true Protestant queen, the hope of the nation. Mary knows she cannot allow it to happen again. Philip of Spain and his advisors press the point. If Mary wants stability, if she wants her marriage to succeed, the girl must die. Mary hesitates, torn between her heart and her throne. Jane is her cousin, a child, innocent of the crimes laid at her feet. But Mary is also in love, and in love with a man who promises her safety, devotion, and a dynasty if only she proves her strength. Philip tells her plainly, mercy is weakness, and weakness will destroy everything. And so Mary signs the death warrant. On February 12, 1554, London wakes under a gray winter sky. At Tower Hill, Guildford Dudley, Jane's young husband, is dragged to the block first. He dies badly, his head severed before a crowd that barely dares to cheer. His body is carted past Jane's window, where she sees the bloody remains of the boy she married. Hours later, it is her turn. Jane walks to the scaffold on Tower Green, clad in a plain white gown. Her face is pale, her steps unsteady. The crowd watches in hushed silence as the young girl tries to appear calm. But when the blindfold covers her eyes, panic overwhelms her. She stretches out her hands, groping at the empty air, unable to find the execution block. "I know not where it is," she cries in terror. A bystander guides her trembling hands to the wood. Jane kneels at last, whispering softly, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe falls, silence follows. A crown stolen by force ends in blood, and the cobblestones drink the last breath of a 16-year-old girl. For England, the execution is a warning. For Mary, it is her first act of vengeance as queen. The cousin she once pitied becomes the price of her throne and the shadow that will stain her reign forever. Yet only months later, London hears a very different sound. Bells ring, not in sorrow, but in joy. Wedding veils and bloody blocks. Typical Tudor, right? The axe that killed Jane Grey clears the way for Mary's crown, but it also gives birth to the queen history will remember as Bloody Mary.
The Spanish marriage proceeds. On July 25, 1554, Philip arrives at Southampton. Mary waits for him at Winchester Cathedral, wearing a gown of black velvet and cloth of gold. She's spent hours preparing for this moment, the first time she'll see her future husband in person. When Philip enters the cathedral, Mary's heart nearly stops. He's even more handsome than his portrait suggested. Tall, elegant, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. Everything about him radiates the kind of controlled confidence that comes from a lifetime of royal privilege. Mary feels overwhelmed and inadequate. She's older, less beautiful, less experienced in the arts of romance. But when Philip takes her hand and kisses it, according to Spanish custom, Mary allows herself to believe that maybe, finally, someone will love her. Mary's motivations for the wedding are simpler and more heartbreaking. She's a 38-year-old woman who has never been loved by a man, and she's convinced that Philip of Spain will change that. The wedding ceremony the next day is magnificent. Mary wears white satin embroidered with diamonds and pearls. Philip gives her a gorgeous ruby ring. The celebrations last for days. But the marriage itself reveals harsh truths Mary isn't prepared to face. Philip and Mary share no common language except Latin. Their conversations are formal and stilted. Philip spends most of his time with Spanish advisors, conducting business Mary isn't allowed to understand. Most painfully, Mary quickly realizes that Philip finds her physically unappealing. Their intimate moments are brief, awkward, and infrequent. Philip treats their marital duties like diplomatic obligations, necessary but unpleasant tasks to be completed as efficiently as possible. Mary tries to make excuses. Philip is tired from his journey. He's adjusting to English customs. He's focused on important political matters. But deep down, Mary knows the truth. Philip married her for her crown, not her heart. The realization is devastating, but Mary clings to one hope that keeps her from despair. Maybe she can win Philip's love by giving him something no political alliance can provide: a son. In November 1554, Mary announces that she's pregnant. The entire kingdom celebrates. Church bells ring across England. Foreign ambassadors send congratulations. Finally, Mary will give England a Catholic heir and prove her value as both queen and wife. Mary herself is ecstatic. This pregnancy will justify every sacrifice she's made for love. This child will secure her dynasty, restore Catholic England, and prove that God has blessed her marriage. She orders baby clothes from the finest seamstresses in Europe. She plans elaborate christening ceremonies. But as the months pass, something feels wrong. May 1555 arrives, the date when Mary expected to give birth. Nothing happens. June passes. July passes. August passes. Mary's body begins to return to normal dimensions. The swelling subsides. There is no baby. There was never a baby. Mary has experienced what doctors now call a phantom pregnancy, a psychological condition where the body mimics pregnancy symptoms without actual conception. The humiliation is unbearable. Foreign ambassadors send reports describing Mary's delusion. English nobles whisper about their queen's mental stability. Philip makes no effort to hide his disappointment and disgust. Mary has failed as a woman, as a wife, and as a queen. But the cruelest blow comes when Philip announces he's returning to Spain to handle urgent business in his father's empire. He's abandoning her. Mary has spent her entire life being abandoned by the men who claimed to love her. And for the first time since becoming queen, Mary Tudor begins to wonder if the only way to heal her pain is to make sure everyone else suffers too.
November 1555. Mary Tudor sits alone in her private chapel at Westminster Palace, staring at a crucifix. She's been queen for 2 years. She's been married for 16 months. She's been humiliated for 39 years. Philip has been gone for 4 months, handling urgent business in the Spanish Netherlands. His letters are formal and infrequent. He makes no promises about when or if he'll return. Mary knows she'll probably never see her husband again. The phantom pregnancy broke something inside Mary that she didn't even know existed. For 39 years, she told herself that all her suffering had purpose, that God was testing her faith, preparing her for greatness, teaching her compassion through pain. Now she wonders if God has been punishing her instead. She thinks about her mother, who died alone and abandoned. She thinks about her father, who destroyed her childhood for political convenience. She thinks about Edward, who tried to disinherit her on his deathbed. Every person Mary ever loved has betrayed, abandoned, or replaced her. Maybe it's time to try a different approach. The transformation begins with a single decision. Mary chooses to interpret her queenship not as an opportunity for mercy, but as a chance for justice. She spent her entire life watching Protestant reformers destroy everything she held sacred. They annulled her parents' marriage. They declared her illegitimate. They corrupted her brother's faith. They tried to steal her crown. Now Mary has the power to return the favor. But here's what history books don't tell you about Mary's persecution campaign. It wasn't born from religious fanaticism. It was born from psychological necessity. Every heretic she condemned represented someone who had hurt her. Every execution was a proxy revenge against people she could never punish directly. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, becomes her primary target. This is the man who annulled her parents' marriage, the man who declared her a bastard, the man who crowned Anne Boleyn and baptized Elizabeth. When Mary orders Cranmer's arrest, she's not just prosecuting a heretic, she's finally getting revenge against the architect of her childhood destruction. Mary has spent decades feeling powerless. Now, for the first time in her life, she controls who lives and who dies. The girl who was once forced to curtsy to her baby sister can now order the execution of archbishops. It's intoxicating, and it's terrifying. Cardinal Reginald Pole, Mary's cousin and papal legate, arrives in England to oversee the Catholic restoration. But Pole quickly realizes that Mary's approach to heresy is more personal than theological. During one of their private meetings, Pole gently suggests that mercy might convert more souls than fire. Mary's response reveals the depth of her psychological wounds. Mercy, cousin. Where was mercy when they called my mother a whore? Where was mercy when they made me serve my father's bastard? Where was mercy when my own brother tried to steal my crown? Mary's voice breaks as she continues. I showed mercy to Jane Grey for months, and they used her name to rebel against me. I showed mercy to the heretics, and they corrupted my brother's soul. Mercy is what the weak do when they're too afraid to demand justice. I am done being weak. On October 16, 1555, Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley are burned at the stake in Oxford. Mary doesn't attend the execution, but she demands detailed reports. She needs to know if justice finally looks like she imagined. The description she receives is horrific. Latimer dies relatively quickly, but Ridley's execution goes wrong. The fire burns too slowly. He screams in agony for nearly an hour before dying. Thomas Cranmer's death on March 21, 1556, becomes Mary's most personal victory and her greatest psychological defeat. She's waited 23 years to watch the man who destroyed her family face justice. But when the reports reach her, Mary's reaction surprises everyone, even herself. She feels no victory, no relief, only emptiness. Some historians believe moments like this may have brought back her own painful memories, being called a bastard, losing her mother, and living powerless for years. Did Mary ever fear she was turning into the kind of ruler she once hated? Maybe, but she brushed such thoughts aside as tricks of the devil. By the next morning, her doubts were gone, and she ordered more burnings. The girl who once begged just to see her mother now rules by fear, and the world will remember her by the flames. As the executions continue, Mary's health begins to fail. She suffers from pounding headaches that leave her in bed for days. Her doctors call it melancholy. Her priests call it spiritual attacks. Whatever the cause, it weakens her body, but not her resolve. Between 1555 and 1558, approximately 280 people were burned alive for heresy. Each execution follows the same horrific pattern. The condemned are tied to wooden stakes. Bundles of wood and straw are piled around their feet. Some have bags of gunpowder tied around their necks to speed their death. If they're unlucky, they burn slowly. The woman who once showed such tenderness to children is now ordering the deaths of parents, leaving their own children orphaned. What breaks Mary's heart, and what she never admits to anyone, is that many of the people she orders executed remind her of her younger self. They're people who refuse to abandon their faith despite threats, imprisonment, and torture. They show the same stubborn courage Mary once showed when she refused to accept her parents' annulment. The same defiance she displayed when she wouldn't renounce Catholicism for Edward. In burning heretics, Mary is symbolically executing the best parts of herself, the parts that once stood up to tyrants instead of becoming one. The people of England begin calling her Bloody Mary. The name spreads through taverns, markets, and churches. Children whisper it like a curse. Adults use it as a warning. But deep down, Mary knows the truth. She's become the monster she once feared. The abandoned child who craved love has transformed into the vengeful queen who spreads terror. But she's trapped now. Each execution makes her more hated, which makes her more paranoid, which makes her order more executions. It's a psychological spiral she can't escape. And the most heartbreaking part? She can't stop. Because stopping would mean admitting that all those deaths were pointless, that her mother's suffering was meaningless, that her own pain didn't justify the pain she's inflicted on others. But Mary's campaign of religious terror has unleashed forces she can't control. Protestant writers of books like Fox's Book of Martyrs begin documenting every execution, every cruelty, every moment of injustice. They are creating a narrative that will outlive Mary's reign and define her legacy forever.
Spring 1556. Mary Tudor stares at a letter that chills her blood. Her spies have intercepted correspondence suggesting that Elizabeth might be communicating with foreign agents. The evidence is thin, the accusations vague, but Mary's paranoia has reached a dangerous edge. She remembers standing in this very room 20 years ago when Henry accused her mother of treason. She remembers how quickly suspicion became conviction, how easily love could turn into betrayal. Now she faces the same torment her father once knew. How do you respond when the person you care for most might be plotting against you? Elizabeth is summoned to court in March 1556. She arrives composed, her expression careful, her clothing modest, a quiet attempt to appear harmless and loyal. Mary observes her every movement,
weighing every glance and gesture for signs of deception. What passed between them behind closed doors, no one truly knows. Some historians suggest Mary confronted Elizabeth about the intercepted letters, pressing for explanations. Elizabeth likely insisted on her innocence, stressing her loyalty to her sister and the crown, while avoiding words that could inflame Mary's suspicion. Mary listens. She feels a mixture of admiration and fear. Her sister's intelligence, her careful reasoning, reminds Mary of her own younger self, clever, defiant, unyielding, but it also sparks unease. Elizabeth could become a figurehead for rebellion, a Protestant rival, a younger woman capable of winning the hearts of the people Mary has fought so hard to command. For a long moment, Mary is caught between the urge to trust her sister and the instinct to control her. Her heart wants reconciliation, but her mind warns that mercy is weakness, and that trust can be fatal. She remembers every slight, every betrayal, every threat to her crown and her religion. The memories fuel a quiet, gnawing fear that has grown over years of paranoia and grief. In the end, Mary chooses a middle path. She confines Elizabeth to Woodstock Palace. Her sister is not arrested outright, nor is she free to move as she wishes. Her letters are scrutinized. Her visitors are limited. It is a form of imprisonment tempered by caution, a way to keep Elizabeth close, under watch, without turning her into a martyr. For months, Elizabeth lives in this shadowed state. She reads carefully, writes cautiously, and adapts to the restrictions imposed upon her. Mary, meanwhile, grows increasingly isolated. Her council members tread lightly, fearful of her moods. Her people whisper about her temper and her judgments. Each new execution adds to her paranoia, reinforcing the belief that enemies lurk everywhere, and that even family could betray her. Mary begins to understand a terrifying truth. Her greatest fear is not death itself, but dying alone, without anyone to trust or love. Every day, she pushes Elizabeth and everyone else who might care for her further away. Each act of suspicion deepens the divide, tightening the spiral of isolation. Elizabeth watches, patient and composed. She learns from Mary's decisions, from the way suspicion and power can twist a ruler. She understands that survival in the Tudor court requires caution, strategy, and restraint. Mary knows, deep down, that when her reign ends, Elizabeth will succeed her. The crown she fought so desperately to claim will eventually rest on the head of the sister she has both loved and feared. Elizabeth waits, patient and intelligent, for Mary's reign to end.
In March 1557, Philip II of Spain returned to England after 18 months away. Mary Tudor, at 41, felt her heart leap with desperate hope. Her husband was home. Perhaps now, finally, their marriage could become what she always dreamed it would be. Within weeks of Philip's return, Mary began to notice changes in her body. Again, reports from court again described the physical signs she displayed. As before, her periods stopped. Her breasts grew tender. Her stomach began to swell. At 41, she dared to believe she was pregnant again. The signs seemed unmistakable, and Mary allowed herself to hope that this child would vindicate everything: her marriage, her reign, her faith. Philip's reaction to the pregnancy news was everything Mary had longed for. He spoke to her gently, held her carefully, and treated her like precious cargo, carrying England's future. After a long time in their marriage, Mary saw genuine affection in her husband's eyes. He attended council meetings with her, discussed state business, and even laughed at her jokes. Mary convinced herself that pregnancy had finally transformed their marriage into the love story she had always dreamed of experiencing. The court prepared elaborate ceremonies for England's Catholic heir. Nurseries were again furnished with the finest cribs. Foreign dignitaries sent congratulations and expensive gifts. Mary spent hours planning the christening ceremony. But Philip had other plans. He needed English support for his war against France, and he knew exactly how to get it. With Mary glowing with pregnancy and desperate to please her attentive husband, Philip began pressing for a military alliance. Mary's counsel was reluctant. England had no business in Spain's continental wars. But Mary, acting on what she believed was wifely duty and intoxicated by Philip's newfound attention, persuaded her reluctant counselors to declare war on France. Mary's psychological state during this period was almost manic. The woman who was once paralyzed by depression now radiated confidence and purpose. She had her husband's love, a child growing in her womb, and a holy war to fight for Catholic Europe. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But as months passed, Mary's due date came and went without event. Spring became summer. Summer stretched toward autumn. Her body began to return to normal. The swelling decreased. Her monthly courses resumed. The pregnancy symptoms disappeared. There was no baby. There had never been a baby. It was again a phantom pregnancy. For Mary, it seems that her body is also betraying her, like others. The realization was devastating beyond words. Mary spent 3 days locked in her private chambers, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. When she finally emerged, she looked 20 years older. The light had gone out of her eyes completely. Philip's reaction was swift and brutal. With no heir coming and his war alliance secured, he had no more use for tender affection. He announced he must depart immediately to command his forces against France. In July 1557, barely 4 months after his return, Philip left England. Mary stood at the window watching Philip's ship disappear into the English Channel, knowing with absolute certainty that she would never see her husband again. Her hand moved instinctively to her flat belly, mourning the child that never existed. The war that Mary had convinced her council to support became a disaster. English forces, unprepared and unwilling, suffered defeat after defeat. In January 1558, the ultimate humiliation arrived. Calais fell to the French. England's last possession on the continent, held for over 200 years, was lost on Mary's watch. The city her ancestors had conquered, the symbol of English strength abroad, was gone forever.
The loss of Calais didn't just diminish England's prestige. It devastated the cause Mary had fought so hard to champion. The English people, who had already grown weary of her religious persecutions, now openly blamed her queen for dragging them into a foreign war that cost them their last foothold in France.
Mary's psychological collapse after the phantom pregnancy and military disasters was complete and heartbreaking. She stopped attending council meetings regularly, delegating more authority to Cardinal Pole and her other advisors. She spent hours in the chapel, praying for understanding that never came. The executions continued, but now they felt mechanical rather than purposeful. Mary ordered them out of habit rather than conviction. The fire that once drove her persecution campaign had burned out, leaving only ash and routine. During this period, servants began finding Mary talking to people who weren't there. She would have long conversations with her mother, Catherine of Aragon, sharing childhood memories and asking for forgiveness for failing to restore England to Rome. Sometimes she spoke to her half-brother Edward, explaining why she had to undo his religious reforms. Most heartbreakingly, Mary sometimes spoke to the children she never had. She would discuss plans for their education, their marriages, and their futures as Catholic rulers of England. These phantom conversations revealed the depth of her loneliness, surrounded by courtiers and servants, but loved by no one. By late 1558, Mary's health failed completely. She suffered from severe depression that manifested in physical symptoms, dramatic weight loss, chronic headaches, persistent fever. Modern doctors might recognize uterine cancer combined with clinical depression, but Tudor physicians could only prescribe prayer and bloodletting. Mary knew she was dying. More importantly, she knew she was dying without accomplishing any of her life's goals. She had wanted to be loved, but ended up hated. She had wanted to restore Catholic England, but only strengthened Protestant resistance. She had wanted to bear an heir, but experienced only phantom pregnancies. She had wanted to prove herself a worthy ruler, but had lost England's last continental possession. All her dreams, all her sacrifices, all her prayers, they had led her here, alone, broken, and remembered not for her devotion, but for the fear she inspired.
November 17, 1558. St. James's Palace. Mary Tudor is dying. At 42 years old, she lies in bed surrounded by flickering candles and worried faces. Cardinal Pole holds her hand while her ladies-in-waiting whisper prayers. Outside her chamber, courtiers wait for news that will change England forever. Mary's final weeks are marked by desperate attempts to prevent what she sees as England's damnation. She refuses for months to name Elizabeth as her successor, clinging to the impossible hope that some Catholic alternative might emerge. She dictates frantic letters to Pope Paul IV, begging him to intervene somehow to prevent Protestant rule. She writes to Philip, who never bothered to return to England, pleading with him to find a way to preserve Catholic England after her death. The question of succession tortures Mary's final days. Her council presses her repeatedly to formally acknowledge Elizabeth, but Mary resists with whatever strength remains in her failing body. How can she give her life's work to the woman who represents everything she fought against? She will undo it all, Mary whispers to Cardinal Pole. Every church restored, every heretic converted, every soul saved. Elizabeth will destroy it all. I cannot be the instrument of England's return to damnation. But Mary's advisors are pragmatic. There is no other choice. No Catholic heir exists. No foreign intervention is coming. The law of succession is clear, and England's stability depends on an orderly transition. They remind Mary that the civil war over succession would destroy the country more thoroughly than any religious change. Facing death, Mary made the most painful decision of her reign. She named Elizabeth as her heir, acknowledging the Protestant succession she had spent 5 years trying to prevent. The sister she once protected would inherit everything Mary fought to preserve. With trembling hands and tears streaming down her wasted face, she formally acknowledges Elizabeth as her heir. But she does not do so out of sisterly love or reconciliation. She does it because she has no choice. The irony was tragic beyond measure. Mary Tudor, who had sacrificed everything to save Catholic England, ensured its Protestant future with her final act as queen. The war between the sisters is deafening and final, and Mary lost it. Mary's final confession to her priest reveals the depth of her despair. She admits she no longer knows if she ordered the executions to serve God or to satisfy her own need for revenge. She confesses that her love for Philip was more desperate than pure. She acknowledges that her phantom pregnancies might have been God's punishment for some unknown sin. "I have failed him," Mary whispers to her priest. "I was chosen to restore England to the true faith, and I am leaving it in the hands of a heretic. How will I face my mother in heaven? How will I face God, knowing I have delivered his people back into darkness?" Her priest offers what comfort he can, But Mary's anguish runs too deep for easy consolation. She dies knowing that everything she sacrificed for, her happiness, her health, her subjects' love, will be undone by her successor. On November 17th, as dawn breaks over London, Mary Tudor takes her final breath. She dies clutching a crucifix, her lips moving in silent prayer, alone except for her Catholic servants. No husband to hold her hand, no children to carry on her work, no guarantee that her faith will survive her death. Within hours, church bells across England ring out the news. But they don't sound like funeral tolls. They sound like liberation. Elizabeth Tudor is proclaimed Queen Elizabeth I. The crowds that gather to cheer England's new Protestant queen are massive and enthusiastic. The contrast with Mary's modest funeral procession tells the entire story of her failed reign. Mary is buried in Westminster Abbey, but even in death, she cannot escape the shadow of her religious struggles. Her tomb becomes a site of pilgrimage for English Catholics, but also a symbol of failure for those who remember the burnings. Elizabeth's first acts as queen confirm Mary's worst fears. She frees the remaining religious prisoners from Mary's persecution campaign. She restores Protestant worship throughout England. Within months, Mary's entire religious program is systematically dismantled as if it had never existed. Mary Tudor's story ends not with reconciliation or peace, but with the crushing weight of inevitable defeat.
December 1558. London. Mary Tudor has been dead for 3 weeks, and already the stories about her are changing. John Fox, a Protestant historian, begins collecting testimonies from survivors of Mary's persecution campaign. His upcoming book, Acts and Monuments, later known as Fox's Book of Martyrs, will cement Mary's reputation as a bloodthirsty tyrant for centuries to come. Fox's version of Mary strips away all psychological complexity. In his telling, she's not a traumatized woman seeking revenge. She's a Catholic fanatic determined to drag England back to papal darkness. His book will be so influential that Bloody Mary becomes as famous as any fairy tale villain. But here's what Fox's book doesn't tell you: the real numbers. Modern historians estimate that Mary's government executed approximately 280 people for heresy over 3.5 years. That's about 80 people per year. Her father, Henry VIII, executed an estimated 70,000 people during his 38-year reign. That's about 1,800 people per year. Yet history remembers Mary as bloody while celebrating Henry as one of England's greatest kings. The difference isn't the scale of violence, it's the story people chose to tell. Henry's executions were political, military, or personal. Mary's were religious. Henry killed enemies of the state. Mary killed enemies of the faith. Henry's victims were mostly nobles and political rivals. Mary's victims included ordinary people, merchants, farmers, housewives. But there's something else that makes Mary's story more disturbing than her father's brutality. Henry never pretended his executions were acts of love. Mary genuinely believed she was saving souls by burning bodies. The psychology behind religious persecution is more unsettling than simple political violence, because it corrupts the very concept of salvation. Mary didn't just kill her victims, she convinced herself she was helping them achieve eternal life. Modern historians are beginning to reassess Mary's reign with more nuance. They point out that her persecution campaign, while horrific, was neither unprecedented nor uniquely cruel by 16th century standards. But here's the question that haunts Mary's legacy. Was she driven by religious conviction or psychological damage? The evidence suggests both. Mary genuinely believed Catholic doctrine was true and Protestant doctrine was damnable. She also genuinely needed to punish the people who had hurt her family and stolen her childhood. Religious faith and personal trauma became so intertwined in Mary's psychology that she couldn't distinguish between serving God and serving her own wounded heart. Maybe that's what makes Mary Tudor's story so compelling and so tragic. She wasn't pure evil. She was human evil, the kind that emerges when good intentions get corrupted by pain, fear, and the intoxicating power of revenge. So, who was the real Mary Tudor? Bloody Mary or Broken Mary? Perhaps she was both. The same woman who burned heretics once comforted her crying baby sister. The same queen who terrorized England once defied her father to protect her mother's memory. The same person who ordered executions also wrote love letters to a husband who despised her. Mary Tudor contained multitudes: victim and victimizer, martyr and monster, sister and enemy. Her story reminds us that the line between hero and villain isn't as clear as we'd like to believe. It reminds us that the people who hurt us most are often people who were once hurt themselves. And it reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one who never learned to love. It's the one who loved too much, trusted too deeply, and broke too completely to ever heal. What do you think? Was Mary Tudor a victim of her circumstances, or was she responsible for her choices? Was she bloody, or was she broken? If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about history's villains, subscribe and help me uncover more forgotten truths about the women who shaped our world. Because behind every monster, there's usually a story we haven't heard.